Well, Patrick describes me as a low nut, but actually, I've got the most difficult job in the world because I am the last Japan optimist. And trust me, in my world, the world of economics, finance, and policymaking, if you're bullish on Japan, it's kind of like somebody coming up to you and whispering into your ear, you know, Elvis Presley, he's still alive. Well, look, the king of rock and roll is probably dead. The Japanese economy and the potential for Japan, I think, is very, very much alive. There's a lot that's being underestimated right now, and I think that Japan is actually pushing the next frontier. And let me walk you a little bit through some of the thought processes here. When you look at the news, everywhere in economics, in finance, you're drowned by these Ds. Debt, deflation, demographics. And it used to be that in the 1990s, oh, well, that's a Japanese problem. Now, Europe? America, anybody? Oh, China. Oh, really? Well, Chinese real estate prices are falling, and as we've seen earlier, the demographics of China is also very, very negative. So there's a lot that can be learned from Japan and how Japan has been dealing with this. Now, let's have a look at just a couple of these things. Debt. Yep, we've got a lot of debt. We've got 230% of GDP worth of debt that's out there, right? Greece blew up when debt to GDP was about 160%. But Japan is not Greece. This is very important. Japan is not Greece. Japan continues to be one of the world's largest creditor countries in the world. The world owes Japan. It's not like Greece owes to the Germans. There you go. I am German, so I'm happy to be in Japan. So Japan remains a very, very big creditor country. Japan doesn't owe anything to the world. In fact, Japan continues to finance the American deficit as well as the European deficits. That's very, very important. There's an intrinsic strength that actually comes from that. Deflation. Yes? We've had deflation, but we never had a deflationary spiral. Prices have adjusted down because in the late 1980s, Japan was much, much more expensive than the rest of the world. Now, give or take, it's about the same thing. Also, look at real estate prices. Real estate prices in Japan have collapsed. They're down almost 90% here in this very part of Tokyo. In fact, in absolute terms, Japanese real estate prices are back to where they were in about 1981. Now, amazing, despite this enormous amount of deflation, society is working rather well. I know there are problems, of course there are problems, but society is stable and is working very well. Now, demographics. Oh, Jesper, how can you be bullish on Japan? Because just look at the demographics. In fact, in 600 years, only 432 Japanese will be left. I mean, that's nice, but I'm sorry, in 600 years, Germany will be the European soccer champion many, many times. It's just not this year. Japan is different because one day we beat the Italians. But but Japan is very different. In fact, in my opinion, the most interesting dynamics that you've got going on in Japan right now is that the demographics is actually in a sweet spot here. Never mind 600 years, look at the next 5 to 10 years. What is this? This is the way a Japanese person gets paid. Like it or not, you basically enter the workforce, you get paid a little bit more every year, until you're in your early 40s, and it's only between your early 40s and your mid-50s that you really start to make good money. But the point is that when you're 55, you actually peak out, and your employment income, your wages collapse very, very sharply. So I can explain 80% of the deflation in Japan simply from the fact that the Mick Jagger generation, that the Dankai, that the baby boom generation, over the last 12 years was in this massive disinflationary wage pull. The good news is that the Mick Jagger generation, well, they're all taxi drivers now, right? You find that they are basically retired, the maximum disinflation pull is over, and the good news is, yes, the young generation is taking over. And you're in that sweet spot right now. You're actually beginning to see that base pay in Japan is starting to rise. And when you look at the national economy, anyway, if you don't have wage growth, you're not going to have economic growth. So here, Japan, watch out. The generational change is actually happening, and it is sayonara deflation in Japan because of the positive sweet spot that Japan is in. The other stuff, why worry about Japan? I mean, look at this. This is the most powerful country in terms of innovation. This chart looks at research and development spending as a percentage of national income. You do that so that you can cross-border compare. And you see that Japan is way up at the top. More than almost 3.5% of GDP goes on research and development. There's actually only one country that has more, which is Israel. Right? You look at Germany, you look at America, much below that. And most importantly, throughout the last 20 years, throughout the 1990s, when the banks were bankrupt, when there was deflation, when politics was a disaster, they continued to invest in the future. And you see it. This is very tangible. Are you aware of the fact that about 42% of all the components in the global smartphones are made by Japanese companies and can only be made by Japanese companies because they've got the precision, they've got the guts to actually do that. The world's most modern passenger airline, basically almost 50% of all the components made by Japan can only be made by Japan. I can go on and on and on. If you look at the innovative power of Japan, Japan is there, Japan is ready to compete, Japan has got the intellectual assets to actually deal with this. What about at home? So we've got all this R&D, we've got all this technology, but what about here in the domestic economy, right? I think one should focus on two areas where Japan is very, very exciting for domestic reasons. And the first one is, yes, turn the demographics into something positive, because there is the Dankai boomers, there is the Mick Jagger generation. Well, they will need creature comforts. So healthcare in Japan is going to be a big boom. I reckon that healthcare spending is going to grow by between 5 and 8% every year over the next decade. That's a tremendous business opportunity, and I always tell, if you give me $100 million to invest in Japan, I will build the Louis Vuitton hospital chain of Japan. Now, the problem is, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is where some of the problems come from. Healthcare growth industry. The government itself, the esteemed graduates of Tokyo University who are sitting in the various ministries, they have calculated a couple of months ago, there is a shortage of about 700,000 healthcare workers and nurses in Japan. Okay? We've got a growth industry here, and we've got a shortage of 700,000 people. So recently I was at the Prime Minister's office, right? And they said, oh yes, Mr. Koll, we are starting to work on immigration. I said, well, excuse me? What does this have to do with immigration? I mean, I'm all in favor of immigration. I'm a gaijin, right? I'm a German. That's almost Japanese. But no, but the point being is, like, you know, you've got this mismatch going on here, right? They say, oh, we're working on this. The point is, you've got this shortage here, and everybody says, oh, only 2% of the Filipino nurses can pass the test. Well, that's not the point. The point is that barely 50% of the Japanese people taking the test can pass the test. Why is the test so difficult? I want you to change my diapers, not to win the Nobel Prize in medicine. You've got these mismatches that are going on here. Also, if you become a nurse in Japan, it's a very laborious process. You're 10 years on the job. What is your pay? You get paid about as much as you get paid when you work part-time at a Starbucks. So double the nurses' pay. The other growth area that we've got is actually agriculture. Agriculture is very, very exciting. You basically have got, a huge resource here, but the average age of a farmer is about 70 years old. Productivity is the worst of anywhere in the industrialized world. A little bit of land reform, and you can actually show if you increase the farm productivity to the level that we have in Italy, which is the worst in Europe, which is saying a lot. Sorry. Thank you for getting this. So Italy, which is the worst in Europe, if you get to the productivity level of farming, as you have in Italy, I can show you that Japan can run a trade surplus in agricultural products. Okay? So that requires government change. That requires changes in rules and regulations. And that's where it gets interesting. That's where the real fight is going to have to start. So I'm bullish on Japan. The ingredients are there. You're in a demographic sweet spot. You've got a lot of intellectual property and technology and patents so that you can compete, right? So let's go out and do that. And finally, the light's blinking here, but the ticker is not working. Finally, I have a request for you. Japan is not sinking, and I think the great symbol is actually the Japanese currency. Japan's currency is the only currency of the advanced world that actually floats on water. Thank you very much.